The wells of Harlan Township did not fail all at once. They failed in order, from east to west, over 14 months, and by the time anybody understood that there was an order to it, 9 families had already sold out and gone, and my brother and I were the only people left in that country who had written down the dates. We were 19 and 17. Nobody was going to listen to us. I want to be honest at the start that nobody did listen to us, not for a long time, and that the reason they eventually did was not that we convinced them, it was that we outlasted them. My name is Ada Rennick, and my brother was Wilkin Rennick, and our parents died 11 weeks apart in the winter of 1886, our father of a burst appendix, and our mother of what the doctor called a decline, and what I have always understood to be grief. We were left with 320 acres in the western part of that township, $200, 4 horses, and the whole of our family's hope, which was a good deal heavier than any of the rest of it. The neighbors were kind. I want that on the record, because it is easy to tell a story like this as though a township were a villain, and Harlan Township was not. Mrs. Deist sent bread for a month. Men came and helped Wilkin get the crop in that first year without being asked and without being paid. 2 separate families offered to take me in, because a girl of 17 keeping house alone with her brother struck people as improper and also as sad. What they did not do, and could not have done, was take us seriously. And so when we started saying, about a year later, that something was wrong with the water in that township, and that it was moving, they heard it the way you hear a child telling you about a dream. The wells in that country were shallow. That is the first thing to understand, and the whole of the trouble. Harlan Township sat over a shallow, water-bearing sand, 30 to 50 feet down in most places, and every farm on it had a dug well of the ordinary kind, a hole 4 or 5 feet across, cribbed with stone or plank, going down to that sand, with anywhere from 8 to 20 feet of standing water in the bottom of it. Good, sweet water, easy to get at, no machinery needed. A man could dig one in a fortnight with his neighbors. Nobody had drilled. Drilling was expensive, and there were drillers working in that part of the state by then, sinking wells 150 and 200 feet into a deeper formation. But a drilled well cost between $200 and $400, which in 1887 was most of a year for a family like ours, and everybody's dug well was working perfectly well, and had been for 15 years, and so nobody drilled. That is not stupidity. That is what anyone would do. The first well to fail was the Ostrom place at the far eastern edge of the township in August of 1887. It did not fail dramatically. Their well simply got low and then lower, and by September the bucket was coming up half full of sandy water, and by the middle of October it was coming up empty most of the day and refilling a little overnight. And everyone said the sensible thing, which was that it was a dry summer, and it was. It had been a dry summer. Everyone said the well would come back with the fall rains. The fall rains came in November, 3 inches over 2 weeks, and the Ostrom well did not come back. That was the first thing my brother noticed, and I want to be clear that he did not have a theory. He had a thing that bothered him. He was 19 years old, and he had been at the Ostrom place helping to deepen that well by hand, which is brutal and dangerous work. And he came home and said to me that it had rained 3 inches and the well had not come up an inch, and that he did not understand how that could be. Neither did I. But our father had kept a farm book, and we had both been raised to write things down in it, and so that night my brother wrote down, "Ostrom well dry, did not recover after 3 inches rain, November 1887. That is the entire origin of this. A boy who could not stop thinking about something, and the book that was already on the table. The second well was the Lauters, 1.5 miles west of Ostrom, in February. The third was Vondracek, another mile west, in May of '88. The fourth was the schoolhouse well. By that summer, with 4 wells gone in 10 months, all of them east of us, all of them in a line, my brother had stopped sleeping properly. He walked. He walked the section roads in the evenings with a rope and a weight and a lantern, and he asked people if he could sound their wells, which meant lowering the weight until it hit water and marking the rope. And most people said yes, because it cost them nothing, and because he was a well-liked boy, and it was a harmless thing to let an orphan do. He sounded 31 wells in that township between June and October of 1888, some of them 4 and 5 times, and he wrote every measurement in our father's book with the date. And that book is the reason I am able to tell you what was actually happening under Harlan Township, which is that the water table was dropping, and it was dropping unevenly, and it was dropping fastest at the east end. Now, what was under that township was not 31 separate pockets of water, one for each farm, which is what every single person there believed, and what my brother himself believed when he started. It was one body of water in one sand, all of it connected, sitting in the ground like water in a sponge. Every well in that township was drinking from the same thing. And that meant something that nobody in Harlan Township had ever had occasion to think about, which is that the wells were not independent. They were in competition. Every gallon anybody pumped came out of the same sponge, and if the sponge was being emptied faster than the rain and the snow melt could fill it, then it did not matter how deep your particular hole was, or how good your particular water had been for 15 years. You were going to lose it too. You were just going to lose it later than the man to the east of you. That is what the order meant. The wells were failing east to west because the land tilted a little that way, and because the east end of the township had been settled first and had more of everything on it, more houses, more stock, more people pumping. My brother did not know any of the science of it. He would not have been able to use the word aquifer. I do not believe he ever heard it in his life. What he had was 31 wells, 400 sounding measurements, and a line on a map he drew on the back of a seed catalog. And what that line said was, "This is coming for all of us, in this order, and we are next but one." He took it to the township meeting in November of 1888, and I went with him, and it was the worst evening of my life up to that point, and I have had some bad ones since. He was 20 by then. He stood up in the schoolhouse in front of about 40 men and a dozen women, with the seed catalogue and our father's book, and he explained it. And he explained it badly, because he had never spoken in front of people, and because he was trying to say a thing that required them to accept 4 separate ideas at once. That the water under their farms was all one water, that it was going down, that the rain was not filling it, and that their own pumping was part of the cause. The last one killed him. That was the one that could not be heard. Because what my brother was standing up in a schoolhouse and telling those men was that they were doing it to themselves. Not the weather, not bad luck, not God. Them collectively, and there was no one to be angry at. And the remedy he was proposing, which was that the whole township agree to limit what it drew and pay together to sink 2 deep drilled wells to the lower formation and share them, meant every family spending money they did not have to fix a problem that most of them did not yet have. The Ostroms and the Lauders and the Vondracheks had the problem. They were also by then the poorest people in that township, because a farm with no water is worth almost nothing, and 2 of those 3 families were already talking about selling, and a man who is about to sell has no reason to invest in a township well. A man named Erhard Boll said the thing that ended the meeting. He was not unkind about it. He said, "Son, you have got a book full of numbers, and I have got a well with 11 feet of water in it. And I am sorry about the Ostroms, but that is a dry corner, and always was." Everyone went home. Nothing was decided. My brother sat at our table until about 2 in the morning with the book open, and I sat with him, and neither of us said very much. That was the first turn, and it went entirely against us. The second turn came the following summer, and it was worse, because it looked for a while like we had been wrong. The winter of 88 and 89 was wet, and the spring was wetter, and the water table came up. It came up everywhere. The Lauter well recovered enough to use. Wells in the middle of the township that had been dropping steadily for a year rose 2 and 3 feet, and the whole business began to look like exactly what Erhard Boll had said it was, a dry spell that had ended. People were pleasant to my brother about it. That was the part that was hardest to bear. Nobody crowed. They just said things like, "Well, we got our rain," in a kind way, and let the matter drop. And my brother went on sounding wells all that wet summer, and what his measurements showed, and what nobody else in that township could have seen, because nobody else had 400 prior readings to compare against, was that the recovery was not a recovery. The wells had come up, but they had not come back up to where they had been in 1887. Every single one of them, in a very wet year, had topped out lower than it had been 2 years earlier. The line was still going down. It had simply gone down a step and up a smaller step. He tried to explain that. It is a genuinely hard thing to explain to anybody that a rise can be a fall, and I watched my brother fail to explain it to 4 or 5 different men that summer, and I remember thinking for the first time that being right might not be worth very much. The third turn was the Deist well in September of 1890. Mrs. Deist was the woman who had sent us bread for a month when our parents died. Her farm was 2.5 miles east of ours, and it was in the middle of the township, not in anybody's dry corner, and her well was the deepest dug well in Harlan, and had been famous for it. 52 feet, 22 feet of standing water when it was dug in 74. It went dry in 11 days in September of 1890. I was there when the Deist well went, or near enough, and I have to tell that part properly, because it is the only time in this whole business that my brother came apart. Mrs. Deist sent her hired boy for him on the 4th day, when the well had gone from 22 feet of water to about 7, and she had begun to be frightened. She sent for Wilkin, not for anybody else, because by then everybody in that township knew who to send for, even while they were disagreeing with him. He sounded it that afternoon, and again the next morning, and again the morning after, and the numbers he wrote in the book for those 3 days are the only entries in 42 years of that record where his handwriting goes bad. On the 11th day, it was mud. She stood there with him and she said, "Wilkin, what do I do?" This was a woman of 61 who had fed us for a month when we were orphans on a farm she and her husband had proved up in 72. And her husband was 4 years dead, and her sons were in Oregon. And my brother had nothing to tell her. That is the thing. He had been right for 3 years, and it had bought him not one single thing he could hand to that woman on that morning. Deep wells cost $400, and there was no township well yet, and would not be for 18 months. And she could haul water and she could sell, and those were the 2 things. And he stood in her yard and said so, because he would not lie to her. He walked home from there, 2.5 miles, and he did not come in the house. I found him sitting on the wagon tongue in the dark, and he had been crying, which I had seen twice before in my life at each of our parents' funerals. He said, "I have 4 years of numbers, and I could not give her a cup of water." Mrs. Deist hauled water for 2 years, from the crossroads well after it came in, and she stayed. She was one of the ones who stayed. She died on that farm in 1901, and my brother was a pallbearer, and that broke it open, because everybody in that township knew that well, and there was no story anybody could tell themselves about a dry corner or a bad location or poor digging. If the Deist well could go, any well could go. My brother was 22 by then. He had been sounding wells for 4 years, and when men started coming to our place that autumn, which they did, 1 and 2 at a time, and asking him what he thought, he did not say a word about the schoolhouse meeting, and he never once in his whole life said the words, "I told you so," to any person in Harlan Township. What he did was show them the book. That is what I want to tell you about my brother, more than anything else. He had a book with 4 years of numbers in it that proved he had been right and 40 men wrong. And he used it as a tool and never as a weapon. And I do not know how he did that at 22 years old, and I have never entirely forgiven the township for how easy they found it to accept. The 2 deep wells were drilled in 1891 and 1892 at the schoolhouse and at the crossroads, 180 and 195 feet into a formation that did not care what the rain had done that year. They cost the township $460 all told, subscribed by 26 families in amounts from $2 to $40, and my brother and I put in $11, which was what we had. 9 families had already gone by then. That is the number that matters, and it is the reason this is a quiet story and not a triumphant one. The Ostroms went in 89, the Vondracheks in 90, the Lauters, who had recovered in the wet year and thought they were safe, went in 91, 6 months before the crossroads well came in. 9 families of a township of 31, and every one of them left because of something that was happening 30 feet underground and had been visible in my brother's book 2 years before it took their farms. I have thought about the Lauters my whole life. 6 months. I should say what those years were like for us, because a person hearing this might imagine my brother as a man on a mission, and he was not. He was a boy, running a farm he was too young to run, and the wells were a thing he did in the evenings. We were poor in a particular way that I have never been able to explain properly to anyone who did not live it. We were not starving. We had a farm and stock, and we ate. What we did not have was any margin at all, and no adult standing behind us. And so every single decision, every year, was made by 2 people under 23 with nobody to ask. Wilkin did the fieldwork of a grown man from the age of 19. I kept the house and the garden and the poultry and did the books and the selling, because I was better at figures than he was. And by the time I was 20, I was the one who dealt with the buyers, which caused comment. And in the evenings, after all of that, my brother walked out with a rope. I asked him once, in about 1890, why he kept doing it when nobody would listen. He was tired, and he had been turned away from 2 places that week by men who were polite about it. And he said, "I am not doing it so they will listen. I am doing it so that when it happens, there will be a record of how it happened." He was 22 years old. Our own well was the thing that made it real for us, and I have not mentioned it yet. We were near the western edge, so we were nearly last in the order, and we watched our own water go down in our own book for 4 years, knowing almost exactly when it would reach us. In 1887, we had 14 feet of standing water. By the summer of 1890, we had 5 feet 3 inches, and we were carrying water for the stock from a spring 1.25 miles off 3 days a week. That is what it is to have a prediction come true slowly. There is no drama in it. There is a rope with knots on it, and a number that is a little smaller than the number from 3 months ago, and the brother who writes it down and says nothing, and the sister who goes to bed and lies there doing arithmetic about how many months are left. The Crossroads well came in about 8 months before we would have had to leave. I have done that sum more than once in my life. Now here is the thing that happened afterward that no one expects, and it is the reason my brother spent the last 20 years of his life doing what he did. The deep wells worked. Harlan Township stopped losing farms, and within about 4 years, having solved their problem, the men of that township quietly stopped bothering about the shallow water at all. Nobody sounded anything. The old dug wells were used for stock and washing and let go where they failed, and the whole hard lesson of 1887 to 1891 turned back into a story people told, which is what lessons do. And my brother watched 2 new families arrive in 96 and 97 and dig shallow wells, because a dug well is cheap and the ground was wet those years. And he went to both of them and told them what was under there and what it did, and one of them listened and one of them did not. He kept sounding. Not 31 wells. There were not 31 left worth sounding. He kept a dozen for the rest of his life 4 times a year and wrote them in the book. And after he married, he taught his wife to do it when he was laid up, and after that, his oldest boy. There is one more thing about those 42 years that I want to put down, because it is the part I had a hand in, and the only part of this I am proud of on my own account. He taught me to sound the well when I was about 24, in the winter, because he had cut his hand badly and could not manage the rope. I had watched him do it several 100 times, and I thought I knew how, and I did not. And he was extremely particular about it, in a way that surprised me. The rope had to hang free and plumb, not touching the crib. You had to feel the weight go slack rather than watch for it, because in a dark shaft your eyes will lie to you. You marked where the rope crossed the curb, always the same point on the curb, and he had cut a notch there in every well he regularly measured, so that the mark would be the same in 10 years as it was that day. And you wrote it down at the well, on the spot, in pencil, not in the house afterward, because a number carried across a farmyard in a person's head is not a measurement, it is a recollection. I asked him where he had learned all that, and he said he had not learned it anywhere. He had worked it out over about 2 years by making every one of those mistakes. When he married Elsa in '94, he taught her the same winter. When his boy Hendrik was 11, he taught him. And by the time the man from the university came in 1931, there were 4 people living in that county who could take a reading the way Wilkin Rennick took a reading, and the hydrologist remarked on it because the consistency of the record over 42 years is the reason it was worth anything at all to him. If the method had drifted, the numbers would have been ordinary numbers.
That is what my brother actually built, not a warning which nobody took, and not a theory which he never had. A way of doing a small thing exactly the same way for 42 years, and 3 other people who could do it after he was gone. He died in 1929 at 61. The book by then was 3 books, and it ran from November of 1887 to August of 1929, which is 42 years of quarterly measurements of the depth to water in the same dozen wells in one Nebraska township, taken by one man and then by his family, and it is the only record of its kind for that part of the state. A hydrologist from the State University came out in 1931 doing a survey after the dry years began, and somebody told him about the Rennick books, and he came to the farm, and my nephew showed them to him. I was there. I was 62 years old, and I sat in that kitchen and watched the man in a good suit turn pages for 2 hours without speaking, and at the end of it he said, to nobody in particular, that he had come out here expecting to have to guess about the 1890s. He borrowed the books. They were copied and they went into a state report in 1933, and my brother's name is in a footnote in that report, spelled wrong. I do not mind that as much as you might think. He would not have minded it at all. What he wanted, from the time he was 19 years old and could not understand why a well did not come back after 3 inches of rain, was for somebody to know, and by the time he died, a great many people knew, and the knowing outlived the man, which is all any of us get. I will tell you the last thing, and then I am done. When the Crossroads well came in the spring of 1892, the men who had drilled it put up a little iron plate on the pump housing with the date on it, the way they did, and my brother, who was 23, took his rope and his weight, the same rope he had been carrying since he was 19, and he coiled it and hung it on a nail inside the pump house and left it there. Somebody asked him what that was for, and he said, "So it is here." It hung in that pump house for 40 years. I saw it in 1931, when the man from the university came, still on its nail, the marks still on it, a knotted rope in a shed that 4 generations of that township walked past without any idea what it was. That is what most of the work of keeping people alive looks like in my experience. A rope on a nail that nobody asks about. Now the Rennicks in Harlan Township are ours, but here is what is true. Shallow dug wells across the plains drew from unconfined aquifers that were entirely interconnected, so that all the wells in a district were in fact drawing on one shared body of groundwater, though almost nobody understood this at the time. When withdrawal exceeded recharge, water tables declined progressively, and wells failed not randomly, but in patterns determined by the slope of the water table and the concentration of pumping, which meant a whole district could be emptied, farm by farm, over several years. A wet year can raise a declining water table temporarily without reversing the decline, which is one of the most persistently misunderstood features of groundwater, and the reason such declines are so often noticed too late. The remedy was, and remains, deeper wells into confined formations less responsive to short-term weather, and coordinated management of withdrawal, which is difficult precisely because the resource is shared and invisible. Long private records of water levels kept by farmers have genuinely proved valuable to later scientific surveys, and several state geological reports of the early 20th century rest in part on such records. The people are imagined, the water going down under them in order from east to west is exactly as it was.